I'm Andy Applebaum. I am a researcher at MITRE. I've been at MITRE for a few years now. I work mainly in MITRE's internal R&D portfolio. I get to, of course, work on ATT&CK. How many of you know about ATT&CK? Decent show of hands. As well as Caldera, automated adversary emulation, automated intrusion response, things like that. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of the lessons we've learned applying ATT&CK-based SOC assessments. This is a talk I wanted to give for a while. And when I saw the CFP for this conference, I thought that it would be perfect for kind of the topic of just general, security operations and getting better. And some of these lessons learned, I think, can be very helpful moving forward. So I saw this slide from the SOC survey summary at last year's Security Operations Summit. I thought it was a good way to maybe kick off the talk a little bit as a way to kind of set the stage for where I think ATT&CK fits in. And largely, I think ATT&CK fits in everywhere. I think ATT&CK can help with a lot of the problems that SOCs are facing today. Of course, I'm very biased having worked on ATT&CK, but I think that ATT&CK can help, bringing ATT&CK into a SOC can help with a lot of these challenges that SOCs are facing today. So as background, I'm sure we've all seen the pyramid of pain, but if you haven't, it's something that David Bianco created to describe things that we as defenders tend to look for, organized by how hard they are for adversaries to change. So things like hash IP addresses, domain names, those are things we tend to look for as defenders. They're really useful for us, but they're pretty easy for an adversary to change. So ATT&CK really comes in at the top of the pyramid of pain as a globally accessible knowledge base, which means it's publicly available online at attack.mitre.org. It really comes in at the top of the pyramid of pain as a framework to enumerate the adversary's behaviors, their TTPs, those kinds of things that are rote and intrinsic to their operations that if we as defenders, if we can look for those things and start really keying in on them, it'll be a lot harder for an adversary to escape our defenses. So a little bit more about ATT&CK. We have something called the attack matrix. At the top of the matrix, you can see we have the tactics up here. These are the high-level adversary tactical goals. You have things like persistence, privilege escalation, command and control, lateral movement. And then in the columns, we have the techniques, which are kind of the behaviors that the adversary exhibits to achieve their tactical goals. And as an example, here is scheduled task. In the ATT&CK framework, we just kind of enumerate the TTPs at a really high level. We also include a little bit of prose about it here, some other metadata you probably can't read out to the side, and then procedures, including kind of specific technique implementation, and examples of adversaries that have used this technique, as well as software that adversaries use to achieve this technique. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the ATT&CK framework itself, but a couple of the key points that really underlie ATT&CK are that first, it's grounded in real data from cyber incidents. It's not kind of a theoretical framework. Everything in ATT&CK is either kind of common knowledge or stuff we've seen adversaries doing in the wild. The second big point about ATT&CK is that it focuses on describing the adversary's TTPs and not the specific IOCs that we should look for. And related to that is that ATT&CK decouples the problem of understanding what adversaries are doing, what their rote behaviors are, from whatever defensive solution we want to deploy. So everything in ATT&CK is really focused on, I want to describe what the adversary is doing from their perspective and not on how I should be defending against the adversary. This allows us to take the framework and use it for whatever use case we want. And I'm not going to go into it, but ATT&CK also has information on threat actor groups as well as software, including like built-in utilities, custom rats, pen testing tools, things like that as well. So kind of everything in ATT&CK includes the TTPs, the groups, the software, includes a lot of information. And we've seen tons of people use ATT&CK for a variety of different things. 4 of the key use cases are detection, writing analytics, evaluating tools, things like that, understanding how my detection maps back to the framework. Threat intelligence is another key use case. Again, ATT&CK contains all that information about software and groups that it provides a lot of information on the landscape of threats. Adversary emulation, kind of focused red teaming, emulating a specific adversary. And then assessments and engineering, which is what I'm going to talk mainly about. So to get into more detail, one of the things I really recommend when I'm talking about ATT&CK is to try to kind of come up with a chart to understand your detective gaps. And here is usually we call this a stoplight chart. It's not the best name given the colors on the chart, but the idea is to take the framework, come up with a rubric for how we want to evaluate each technique, and then score each technique based on that rubric. That's really high level, so here's an example where we take the exfiltration tactic and we score things either white if we have low confidence we're going to detect it, yellow if we have some confidence that we can detect it, or green if we have high confidence that we can detect it. And this simple chart allows us to understand how our defenses stack up to an adversary. And by doing this over the whole framework, I can get kind of that big picture, 10,000-foot overview of what my defenses look like if I was comparing to kind of the threats that we commonly see adversaries, or the behaviors that we commonly see adversaries following. Some other key benefits of coming up with this chart is that first, with knowledge of my detection gaps, I can communicate my capabilities with a common reference point. This can be something that every team within my SOC, every functionality, all the tools, all the things that I have, can refer back to this, because this bubbles up from everything. I can also inform new tooling purchases for the biggest return on investment. If I'm already doing a great job covering exfiltration, if all my tools already cover that tactic, there's no need for me to go out and purchase yet another tool that's going to cover exfiltration. I can also identify data sources needed for detection. If I know I have a lot of gaps in, say, lateral movement, I might say, okay, instead of forwarding additional endpoint logs to my SIM, I might start looking at net flows or something else that I can start gathering and start optimizing all the things that I'm looking at within my network. And then finally, developing analytics targeting high-impact threats. We can know what our gaps are and figure out how those gaps stack up to the adversaries that we're likely to face, and then actually start developing analytics to detect those adversaries and the TTPs that they use. So this talk is really focused on getting towards the detection gaps. Our experiences, or the ones that I'm going to talk about, are really from running attack-based SOC assessments. This is where we come in with attack and try to come up with that detection chart for kind of a SOC that we're evaluating. This is a very short, rapid-fire methodology to approximate detection gaps in the SOC. And we've done this enough times that we've been able to gather a lot of kind of key lessons learned and things that other people can use. The focus here is that we want to kind of share some of these lessons learned. We want to present them in a way that isn't just focused on like, hey, if you're a third party and you're running an assessment, here's what you should do. We also want to present them in a way that's usable for people who want to run an in-house assessment or a different type of assessment, or something like red teaming or adversary emulation, or just general attack integration. So things here are really going to focus on kind of attack and assessments and how we can bring both of those into our SOC operations. I think the big takeaway from this talk is that attack can really help solve some of the hard problems, and some of the lessons learned we're going to talk about here is going to help kind of with some of the tips, tricks, pitfalls, things to avoid, things like that, to kind of make it easier if you want to integrate attack or run an attack-based SOC assessment. So kind of getting started using attack for assessments. Oftentimes we have something like a SOC, we have a network, we have a SOC, and then the SOC is guarding the network. I apologize, this is really simple. And then we have attack, and we want to get this kind of coverage map of what our detective gaps are. But the big question is, how do we actually do that? If we're not currently using attack, how do we start bringing attack into our SOC? And one of the things that we like to recommend to do is to run an attack-based SOC assessment. Here, the idea, at least in my case, is to run this as a third-party assessment team, come externally to the SOC, into the network, and then try to come up with what that detective coverage heat map looks like, and give that back to the SOC to kind of to let them go kind of that next step and what they should end up doing. Now, having said that, the methodology I'm going to talk about isn't specific to third parties. You can do this in-house too. It's just kind of you'd change a couple of the things. So we developed at MITRE a methodology to map the SOC's detection capabilities back to attack. The idea was to paint broad strokes of the detection capabilities to kind of provide that big picture overview of here's how your detection, here's how it stacks up to the attack framework. The methodology provides a rapid first look into the SOC's current state. And it's useful for SOCs that want to integrate attack into their day-to-day operations. They really want to, say, oh, this is attack, it's great, I want to start using it, but I need the first place to start doing it. Some details on the process are first, it's hands-off. There's no hands-on system activities, no red teaming, no adversary emulation, no atomic unit tests. It's really just documentation, analysis, and interviews. It's a scalable time frame. We've run these from 1 to 4 months typically. From an input, we have a survey that we hand out that we use as input. We also get SOC documentation and then some very short interviews with SOC personnel. And then as output, we have the detection heat map, a prioritization plan of techniques to focus on, and then a set of recommendations that the SOC can follow. The process itself is divided into 4 key phases. In the first, you want to set the stage. Once everything is set and everybody's on the same page, then you analyze the tooling and documentation. After analyzing and tooling and documentation, you jump to the interview set, and then once you have all the data from the interviews, from the documentation, from the tooling, you produce and you deliver results. A little bit more detail for setting the stage. First, when you're kind of scoping this and getting ready to run this, you want to give interview previews to the SOC you're evaluating, or if you're doing it in-house, you want to make sure you're establishing things with leadership so they know what's going on. You want to set expectations and then discuss the timeline you want to follow for the assessment. When you're analyzing tooling and documentation, we tend to look for things like tools, sensors, kind of just getting a list of that, how often each one is used, how important it is, any analytics that the SOC is using. Log collection guidance is another key thing to look for, and then any other relevant documentation. And lots of things can be relevant, but a couple examples are incident summaries, incident reports, red team reports, hunting procedures, things like that. Conducting interviews, for us, usually we have some standard questions we ask. We always look to clarify any ambiguities in documentation, and then it's great to ask SOC personnel when you're doing an assessment like this for their known gaps or their known strengths that they have. Because you can, even if they're not conveyed in a way that talks about attack, you can map those back to the attack framework. And then finally, producing and delivering results. Coverage heat map, recommendations, a written report, and an outbrief. Now this methodology is the one that we tend to follow, but it's not the only one. There's lots of other ways that you can do this. So the first time we did this was in 2017. Since then, they're typically 1 to 2 months, depending on the scope. We've done a handful of full assessments. We've done a handful of smaller assessments. And there's been tons of interest. A lot of people really like the idea of taking that detective gap chart, kind of getting that into their SOC. We've had a lot of good outcomes. Analytic development, general SOC improvements, things like that. But most importantly, we've learned a lot along the way. We've learned a lot of lessons for us as we're conducting these third-party assessments. We've learned lessons that can be useful for people doing this in-house. And then we've learned general lessons that can be useful for people who want to integrate attack into their SOC. So I'm going to walk through each stage of kind of the assessment process, talk a little bit about it, as well as some of the lessons learned and kind of key takeaways, as well as tips for each of those stages. The first is setting expectations. Sometimes some people look at attack and they think it's a silver bullet. They just want to do attack and say, we're doing that attack checkbox and we're done. That's all we need to do. Oftentimes, people will have skewed expectations of what either attack or an attack assessment will provide. And this applies to either doing an assessment as a third party or in-house or just generally integrating attack. So some of the myths around kind of running an attack-based SOC assessment, the first is that running an assessment is enough to use attack. That's not really true. If you run an attack-based SOC assessment, if you come up with that chart, that's really just a glimpse into your current attack coverage. That's not kind of good. That chart that you have isn't going to last for the next 2 years. It's going to change over time as kind of adversaries change, and then your own kind of internal SOC procedures change. The second myth is that the results from the assessment are perfectly accurate and exist in perpetuity. Really, again, attack assessments and kind of coming up with that chart, that's just a snapshot in time. That isn't something that kind of exists for the next couple of years. It's something that shows you what's going on right now. And then another good one is that doing an assessment will improve your security posture. Doing an assessment is great, and it can help you improve your security posture, but only if you follow up on the assessment. If you come up with what your detective gaps are, you need to actually act on those gaps and figure out what you should do next. And then the last one is that an attack-based SOC assessment will tell you specific gaps and specific components. If you're doing an assessment that's more like red teaming or adversary emulation, this is true, but if you're doing an assessment that's more paper-based, where you're doing interviews, documentation analysis, things like that, really, this isn't going to talk about the very specific components that you want to talk about. It's just going to paint broad strokes. The bottom line is if you're bringing attack into a SOC, make sure you set the right expectations with all stakeholders, particularly if you're doing an assessment. So a little bit around messaging for attack-based SOC assessments. This is mainly important for the third-party assessments, I think, but a couple of these points I think are just more generally relevant too. The first is that the word assessment can oftentimes have a very negative connotation. People hear that they're being assessed and they immediately start to worry They think they're being judged, they're being evaluated, and the assessor is really looking for failure. With attack-based SOC assessments, that's not what you want to do. With an attack-based SOC assessment, you want to help the SOC, you want to help them improve, you want to get better. When you're coming up with that chart, you're trying to say, hey, here's where you're doing well, and then here are the areas where you're improving. You don't want to say, here's where you're doing well, and then here's where you're failing. So the word assessment can have a lot of negative connotations with it. And some of the risks of using something like assessment, first, staff might not comply with the process. Now the assessment requires more time, more effort. The whole process is a little bit more intensive. Number two, the staff might worry about how the results are being used. Now they're going to nitpick details, wordsmith the report. It's going to be, again, a lot more onerous, a lot more difficult for you to actually get your job done. This is a really bad one, too, where if you're running something and you're calling it an assessment and it's viewed as antagonistic, personnel might misrepresent or exaggerate their current capabilities. This is really bad because now the results of the assessment, that heat map of like what you're covering, it's going to be wrong, and you're going to think you're secure when you're actually not. And then the last one, with leadership, if you position this as, hey, we're going to do an assessment, leadership might overreact to the results. If they see a heat map and it's got a lot of gaps in it, someone might look at that and say, uh-oh, this is really bad. We need to totally redo everything. That can cause panic. It can cause a whole change in your architecture and cause a lot of bad things. So some of the tips for kind of staging attack-based SOC assessments, the first is to use a phrase other than assessment, which begs the question of why we keep calling it attack-based SOC assessments, but I like the phrase. Some other words instead of an assessment might be a study or an appraisal. People are a lot more receptive if you say, I'm going to do a study, kind of come up with what the detective gaps are. Another tip is to make sure leadership understands what the goal of the assessment is and how the assessment works, and to also design the assessment to align with leadership goals. Then position the assessment as a stepping stone to improvement. Don't position it as a way to kind of gauge performance. You're not looking for failure, but you're looking for areas of improvement and where you should go. And then the last one is to ensure the staff know that they're not being evaluated. It's really just the processes, the policies, and the tooling that you're focusing on. You're not looking at people, you're just looking at the SOC overall. Oh, and then the last one. Always prepare to follow up after running an assessment. As I said, an assessment is only kind of a snapshot in time. That understanding gaps, that chart is really, this is my detection gaps today, but you need to have a plan for after that. So the next stage is kind of getting the data, the tools, the documentation, the interview portion. Here, when you're analyzing tools and documentation, one of the things that we like to do is take each tool, map it to the data sources that it detects, and then map those data sources back to the techniques that they detect and attack. And then based on the documentation, you can kind of use this to approximate the general defensive coverage. For some products, this is a little bit easier based on the documentation. For others, it can be a little bit harder. For analytics, the idea is that you want to take each analytic, look at the actual code for the analytic, figure out, will it detect behavior or will it detect something static? Is it looking for an IOC or is it looking at something that an adversary might be changing, that's something that's more kind of intrinsic in their operations? And then once you get kind of a handle on that, try to figure out, okay, if it is looking for a behavior, what techniques in the framework will it actually detect? And then with documentation, this one can be hard because you're often looking at processes, procedures, ConOps, things like that. But whenever possible, try to map them back to attack. A really good example is if you're looking at documentation, you're a third-party assessor, even if you're doing this in-house, say, oh, here's an account lockout policy. After 3 tries, we're going to lock out an account. That can actually impact the brute force technique. That can stop an adversary from executing that. And then for each component you look at, create a coverage heat map to track your work. So that if somebody says, well, wait a minute, why isn't scheduled task covered? I thought I covered that. You can go back and say, well, here's your tools, here's your analytics, and here's the documentation, and here's why we didn't think that scheduled task would be detected if an adversary were to execute it in your SOC. Looking past documentation, interviews are very, 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 very important. Documentation is great, but conducting interviews, actually talking to people who are using the tools, using the analytics, working in the SOC, gives you a lot more complete knowledge of what's going on in the day-to-day. First, documentation is often stale. As we've done this, or as I've seen, a lot of SOCs are using tools that they haven't quite documented yet. And sometimes the tools are being used differently in practice than in theory. And then on a related note, the tools are only effective as their deployments. A lot of people will configure tools to use them in a specific way, to look for specific things, to kind of focus on something that they're really looking for. Tools can also be modified with different modules, add-ons, configuration changes. Really, the documentation from a vendor is going to tell you, here's how the tool works, but the people are going to tell you, here's how I'm actually using the tool. The last one is that personnel can speak more concretely about coverage. Documentation, when you're looking at it, you can kind of draw inferences about how it maps to attack, but if you have somebody who's using a specific tool on a day-to-day basis, you can say, hey, how does this tool actually detect credential dumping? You can ask those specific questions to get a better understanding of how the tool works. And then lastly, documentation can be ambiguous. It's not always clear, especially if you're just like finding random documentation on the internet. It's not always clear what exactly a tool is doing or what data sources it's monitoring. Some tips for conducting interviews if you do want to do this kind of interview process. First, break the questions down by team. Don't ask everybody the same exact question all the time. Have questions aligned with different functionalities in the SOC. The second is to walk through examples. How would you detect lateral movement? How would you detect misuse of credentials? Having people kind of walk through how they would tackle these examples gives you a better understanding of how the day-to-day operations map back to attack. If these kinds of questions go well, focus on specific tactics or focus on specific techniques. If they don't, if you're not getting a lot of traction on like, well, we'd be able to detect lateral movement doing X, Y, and Z, try asking general questions like, are you able to monitor internal network traffic? Ask each team what their favorite tool is and why that tool is their favorite. How often do they use it? What do they look for? What are its key strengths? What are its key weaknesses? This can help clarify documentation and also tell you what tools are most important. And then lastly, always be prepared for the interviews, but be prepared to change your script. I've done interviews before where I had a whole library of questions all prepared, and then when I talked to people, I found out all the stuff I was looking at in documentation, that wasn't what was going on the day-to-day. So all those prepared questions really didn't help. Well, they did, but not that much. So the next big step is to kind of produce an actual heat map, to kind of take all these data sources you've looked at and combine them into one unifying heat map. And as an example, this was kind of an early color scheme I tried to use once during an assessment. And this made a lot of sense. We broke it down into high, some, low, or no confidence of detection, and then static detection. This made a lot of sense to me, and when I looked at it from a scientific perspective, I thought this was great. But the more I talked to people about this chart, it was really bad. No one liked it. It was too much granularity. The color scheme was weird. Everything was just off with this. Really, if the goal for an attack-based SOC assessment, at least as a third-party assessor doing this, your goal is to paint broad strokes, and something like this is maybe helpful for certain people, but for others, it's really not what you're looking for. Instead, settling on something that conveys the right information at the right layer is of critical importance. In this example, removing just one category, I think removing no and combining that into low, was enough to combine the chart and kind of change a little bit of what the coverage map was underneath, but it was enough to kind of tell leadership as well as the day-to-day employees, like, hey, here's what your coverage looks like. So we didn't lose a lot of information, but we were able to convey a lot more. More generally speaking, regardless of your specific use case, even if you're not doing an assessment or coming up with like that detection gap chart, if you're going to create a heat map, always have a good scoring scheme. Define categories that are relevant to your domain and avoid mixing category types. It gets very confusing if you want to have confidence of detection and then likelihood of execution on the same chart. It gets a little too busy and it can be hard to convey the big picture that you want to go for. Also, know your audience. Oftentimes I found when talking with leadership, they want the big picture, but when talking with staff and people who do the day-to-day, they like having the details. And then the last one is choosing a good color scheme. It's really important for conveying information, is to choose something that conveys it in a way that's effective. And off of that, if you do end up using a heat map, avoid the color red. I found that people see red, and all of a sudden these alarms all start going off, like this is a crisis, this is a problem, everything's really bad when you use red. Red really communicates the wrong message. People see red and they assume it's saying, look here, this is a crisis, this is a huge problem, the sky is falling down. If you're going to use red, only use it as needed when it really is a big problem. Instead, try to use a softer color palette. It conveys these kind of same message but it's a lot easier for people to digest. Excuse me. It positions the results as much less antagonistic as well. These aren't areas of failure, the ones in white here. These are areas of improvement. And then the last thing is, even outside of assessments, be wary of using the color red. I feel silly recommending something so specific, but I found it helps a lot when talking about attack or coming up with heat maps or doing anything like that. Red can really throw people off. Another important lesson is to always kind of focus on what heat maps are. They're not axiomatic, they aren't ground truth, they aren't kind of these universal things that we always need to have and always need to go to as kind of that one core document. They're really helpful, they're easy to understand, they're tangible and straightforward, and they provide the high-level picture that's useful to kind of everybody at every level, but there are problems. First, coverage doesn't always align with how attacks are executed in practice. Techniques can be executed in many, many, many different ways, and the detections are going to be different for each. If you're saying I have good coverage of credential dumping, that might only be for the ways that you were thinking about executing it today. That might change in the future. And then per technique detection isn't always the right level of abstraction. Another important one is that coverage is not static. What you're covering today, you might not cover tomorrow. Attacker TTPs, defender practices, all those things rotate. Don't just ignore something if you come up with a heat map and you say, well, this is green, so I'm done with this. That's not what you should do. You should always be thinking about what my current coverage is, how relevant my current detection map is, things like that. And then remember, attack heat maps are almost always just approximations. They aren't ground truth. They aren't, as I mentioned, they aren't axiomatic. If you're doing this as a third party, make sure the SOC you're doing this for, make sure they know this. You really need to convey that information to them. And if you're doing this in-house, make sure that your colleagues as well as your leadership knows that this isn't exactly what our coverage is. It's only an approximation. It's a good approximation, but it isn't, well, we're secure on valid accounts now, so we're done with that technique forever. The last recommendation for heat maps is to complement them with prose. If you're doing an assessment, don't just hand off the heat map, try to describe it. 1 or 2 paragraphs can go a long way towards actually distilling key things about what a heat map looks like. With a short summary, you might want to look for notable attack strengths or notable attack gaps. Highlighting both of those is important. Try to talk at the tactic level in a summary, but wherever possible, refer to relevant techniques and important techniques, things that you should really care about. Commonly used techniques, threat actors, things like that. 1 or 2 paragraphs of information on kind of how your coverage stacks up goes a long way towards kind of getting that heat map more digestible for people. And then the last one is don't stop at attack. If you're doing an assessment, include attack. It's great. Summaries are great for the heat map. But if you observe general trends as well, also talk about those. And then the last part of the assessment is delivering results. It isn't enough to just deliver a heat map like this and say, all right, we're done. We don't need to do anything. Try to come up with different techniques that you can focus on in the short term for some wins. Some examples here are, I've selected exploit public-facing application and data content wipe. You might come up with a prioritization plan and say, well, let's select these techniques because they're really significant to kind of the day-to-day operations we have. They can really disrupt our operations. Another example is command line interface, credential dumping, and standard application layer protocol. These are ones that we can we can select because they're popular. Maybe focus on popular techniques or ones that are easy to execute, things like that, kind of as a way to scope what you're looking at and where the gaps are and where the next steps are. Another strategy is to look for techniques that are used by relevant threat actors, ones that have been known to target your network or target your sector or target your industry. Focusing on those can help you, again, scope down to something more straightforward. And the last category is focusing on techniques that you actually have the logs to write analytics for. Some tips for prioritization. First, small lists of techniques are great for short-term wins. Just making some progress is a good thing. I tend to kind of see 2 big paradigms when you're coming up with techniques to focus on. One is to recommend focusing on 1 or 2 techniques across all the different tactics. And the other is to kind of focus on many techniques in one tactic category. Which method is appropriate for you will depend on your specific application. And then focus on techniques that are immediately relevant. Are they used by threat actors that you care about? Are they popular? Are they frequently occurring? Are they things we see a lot in the wild? If so, you'll get a bigger ROI if you're able to improve on those. Are they easy to execute, and do they enable more techniques? Focusing on things that are stepping stones to other techniques can help you kind of as you're rolling this process out. And the last one is, are the necessary logs readily accessible? If you're coming up with like short-term wins, you don't want to recommend focusing on techniques that you don't actually have the logs for. Another lesson learned is to always try to give tangible recommendations. It's really easy to kind of speak at high level, but the more specific you can get when you're recommending processes or improvements or anything for a SOC to do to kind of bring attack more into day-to-day operations, the more specific you can get, the better. Consider giving kind of short and long-term recommendations. Don't just focus on things that are immediately doable, but try to break it down into here are some things that are immediately doable, and then here's some longer-term trends you might want to go for. Breaking it down that way can make it a lot more digestible to people. Provide examples and starting points. If you're going to recommend analytics towards techniques they should focus on. Use a prioritization plan. Threat groups to emulate for adversary emulation. If they do want to upgrade to red teaming adversary emulation, live assessments, recommend specific threat groups to focus on, and then any reading material to help get started. Just providing some place that you can start with helps a lot for a lot of different SOCs. And then the last one is just prioritizing the recommendations for triage. Presenting 10 different recommendations unordered isn't always the most helpful. Order them based on the biggest return on investment. That can help a SOC that might have limited resources focus on something specific and actually get something done and feel like they're making progress and kind of further their integration as they're moving forward. As an example recommendation, one of the things we always like to recommend is just adding analytics. The idea here is you start with an initial assessment, focus on the high priority techniques. In this example, it's like remote file copy, Windows admin shares, valid accounts, and then add analytics for those techniques, either using kind of publicly available analytics or developing your own in-house, and then update your coverage map so that you can keep tracking your coverage over time so you don't have to keep redoing an assessment. So I want to kind of jump back to the hard problem slide that I set up here. I kind of blanket said that attack can help, and I wanted to maybe talk about some of the specifics looking back at this chart. For some of these, I think that having knowledge of your detection gaps can really help some of the big challenges that SOCs are facing. First, if I'm able to map tools back to attack, I can see how my tools overlap and I can understand how to integrate them better. Without problems facing kind of management support, attack can be great where you do an assessment and you come up with, hey, here's what my coverage looks like. You can show that to management and kind of keep them in line with what's going on. If you don't have enterprise visibility, aggregating heat maps can kind of help. I think not having enterprise visibility might be a different thing, but aggregating heat maps can help you understand where your current gaps lie and also what parts you don't have visibility into. Having too many alerts, what you can also do with attack here is you can prioritize alerts based on the attack TTPs that they might map to. The silo mentality, attack can be a common language that can facilitate communication across the different teams. And in the lack of context, you can start enriching alerts with their attack TTP info, and that can kind of help you understand the overall context of where the alert fits in. Assessments fit into this as well. First, when you run an assessment, you're going to have this side effect of producing a tool heat map. That can help inform how you perform the tool integration, kind of mapping it back to attack and seeing where everything overlaps. When you run an assessment, you get those heat maps. Those are easy to digest. They show great progress. They show your status. You can also use a heat map to say, hey, if I start rolling in this data source, this is what my coverage is going to look like in the future. That can be great to bubble up to management and start getting support for different efforts you want to prioritize. Assessments also provide those kind of smaller coverage charts for different tools, different things that can help you understand where your gaps are in visibility. Prioritization, as part of this process, you can identify high impact TTPs, and that can help you understand which alerts you should potentially care about more. And then assessments also help orient teams on the same page. If you say, all right, we're all siloed, we're all doing something different, I'm going to go and do an assessment, look at each team, see how we can maybe improve their operations and see how we can integrate attack, you can start bringing some people together. And then lastly, when you're having a problem understanding the context for alerts, one of the side effects of running an assessment is you're going to map your analytics and your alerts to the attack TTPs, and so you're able to kind of do that enrichment when you're rolling everything together. Some sound bites and takeaways. If you're going to use attack, make sure you set the right expectations. Attack and attack-based SOC assessments are fantastic, but they're not silver bullets. You need to make sure you're doing this long term, you're following up on it, you have a plan. Coverage isn't just tools, it's people, processes, it's a very holistic concept to understand what your coverage is. Create heat maps that convey exactly what you want to convey. Don't get too detailed, don't get too abstract, and please don't use red. And then don't stop with a heat map. Identify key techniques to prioritize in the short term, and have some sort of plan or a set of recommendations that you can follow on. That can help you go from, hey, I just ran an assessment, I'm going to go throw it on the shelf and I'm done with it, to actually start doing things and start improving. Longer term, attack-based SOC assessments are really one component as part of kind of a bigger pipeline. The idea is we can run an assessment and we can start assessing our defensive coverage. Once we assess our defensive coverage, we can identify high priority gaps, then we can tune or acquire new defenses. Attack sits underneath this as a way to inform how we're assessing, how we're identifying, and how we're kind of understanding new defenses as that kind of underlying framework. Bigger picture, there's other things you can be doing as part of this process as well. You might kick off this cycle with an assessment, but then to identify high priority gaps, you start looking at attack, you look at relevant threat models, you look at sightings data, real things people have seen in the wild to identify which techniques are most appropriate or most important. Tuning and acquiring new defenses, you can look at attack evaluations. This is something MITRE is doing right now to understand how different vendors map back to the attack framework, as well as public resources that you can use that might be open source that you can bring into your operations. And then as you make progress, instead of just doing an assessment in the future, start bubbling up to adversary emulation exercises. Actually have an adversary go in there, or a red teamer go in there, not an adversary, a red team go in there and stress test your network to understand where your gaps actually lie. So with all that said, this is my last slide. Some links and some context, that's me. Attack is publicly available online. We have a Twitter account that's very active. We have a lot of stuff in Attack in sticks, as well as some code to kind of process and do fun analytics with Attack, and then some other tools on the right.
Again, let's thank Andy for this fantastic talk.